Greetings, let's talk through another essay. In this video we're going to be looking at evaluate the view that membership of the EU undermined parliamentary sovereignty. We're going to be looking at the question, we're going to be talking about what you needed to include, then we're going to be looking at some of the potential answers, and then some of the synoptic issues that might come up. So it's a pretty straightforward question. We're asking essentially whether being a part of the EU and transferring certain bits of sovereignty to the EU has undermined Parliament's ability to control the country. So to what extent is Parliament still able to control us, and how much does it get blocked? And there's lots of different ways of kind of tackling this, but as always, you need to make a case for one side or the other. You need to be saying, yes, it has undermined it, or ultimately, no, it hasn't really. You need to be kind of using your killer arguments. You need to be providing evidence over time. So some actual cases where Europe and the Parliament have kind of come into conflict, and creating a case of approximately introduction, 3-4-ish sections, and then a kind of a conclusion showing which way you've fought. Now this is paper 2, so you also need to include a synoptic link. So that means at some point in the essay you need to make a decent reference to a topic which is in paper 1. So that would be the media, electoral systems, democracy, etc., etc. And if you don't, you could get penalised and taken down to band 2. We haven't talked a lot about synoptic links, but I'm going to start mentioning it now as we kind of go through. So what arguments could you have brought in? Let's start on the left-hand side. So first of all, we can say, so this is the side that says, yes, it has undermined the UK. Now, EU laws are superior to UK laws. Part of joining the EU is to say that when there is a conflict between the UK law and the EU law, they take precedence. The factor tame case is a famous one where the Supreme Court ruled, or it wasn't the Supreme Court at the time, it was the law lords, in fact, ruled that the EU law on fishing overruled ours. If you're not sure about that case, or you want to know more about the EU stuff, go and watch the video that I made with Ria. It'll go through those cases and give you a really good understanding of this topic. And in fact, probably even better than this video, which is just looking at the essay, go and watch that video with Ria and it'll tell you loads about the relationship with the EU. We can't veto in certain areas. So a veto is when you just say, no, we're not doing that. Now we do have vetoes in certain areas, but in other areas like employment, we actually have to go along with what the EU says. So if it's called qualified majority voting, and basically it means if the majority of other countries votes yes to something, then we have to go along with it even if we vote no. Also, the 4 freedoms of the single market are non-negotiable. Freedom of goods, freedom of movement, freedom of money, and freedom of services. We can't just close our borders anymore, which is one of the big things that came up in the Brexit debate. You know, that is a big issue for many people, that we have lost the ability to say no. And lastly, Parliament must follow the ECJ rulings. Now, technically, the European Court of Justice is not the same as the EU, so I'd be careful using that one. But nevertheless, there is an element there to which the two organisations are, one feeds into the other. Now, all of those arguments above can be either built up or knocked down, depending on what other examples you kind of use. So make sure that you're either building up those arguments, or you're building up those arguments and then knocking down the opposite. So don't just give me an essay where you're saying, so on one hand this, but on the other hand this. So taking the top one, for example, if you wanted to build it up, you really go down the factor tame case, and you kind of say, we have all of our laws now can be struck down if they are in conflict. You really build out that idea that UK laws, parliamentary laws, can be struck down. But if on the other hand you want to knock that argument down, then you kind of say, well, actually, but we always have the ability to leave the EU, or we don't actually, although there are certain rulings that have been made that we just haven't followed. So for example, prisoners. The European Court of Justice made rulings to say that we have to allow prisoners a vote, and we've just ignored it, which isn't particularly good from a democratic point of view, but it's good from a parliamentary sovereignty point of view. So choose your direction and go with it. Now, on the other side, to disagree, Brexit. At the end of the day, Parliament can retain its sovereignty by leaving the EU, which is what effectively has happened. Maybe that's a killer argument, you decide. EU members do retain sovereignty in non-trade areas. Now, the European Union is essentially a trade organisation. It has started to kind of go into areas like the environment and currency and things like that, but by and large, everything it deals with are to do with trade. So the Parliament does retain a lot of sovereignty in non-trade areas. So, for example, war, military, that kind of stuff. You could also attack the wording of the question here. Pooled sovereignty is not the same as undermining it. So sharing your sovereignty with someone else is not the same as you losing yours. Like if I said to you, work in pairs with someone, that's not the same as you lose half of your ability to make decisions. You can word it like that, but you could write an interesting kind of maybe half paragraph in this essay about just attacking the language of the question. You are allowed to do that. As long as you back it up with knowledge and ideas and understanding of politics, you can play with language. And lastly, the UK has its own special opt-outs and vetoes. So, for example, we never joined the euro, even though most of other members of the EU did at that time. We negotiated our own special opt-out, meaning we're not doing that. And we do get to veto certain things, so we retain sovereignty in lots of different areas. Pick a side, argue for it, argue against it, whichever way you want to do. Now, I said earlier, you have to make reference to something back in paper one. And I think this is actually this is actually a nice question. I might well have picked this one if I had this exam question come up. The tricky bit of this question is actually making a synoptic link, making some sort of reference to political parties, electoral systems, democracy, etc., etc. Probably the easiest one for me might be to do with democracy and kind of talk about how the democratically elected members of the House of Commons perhaps no longer have influence over the EU, the unelected European Commission, or something like that. But even then, it's a bit tricky. So here's some suggestions from the Mark scheme. So you could make a suggestion. You could link it to political parties, talking about how different political parties have different views over parliamentary sovereignty. The Liberal Democrats saw that there was absolutely no problem here with sovereignty, whereas the Conservative Party did. Or you could talk about the role and the impact of the media, e.g. some newspapers argued strongly that European membership undermined parliamentary sovereignty. So newspapers were very much campaigning to say, let's take back control and things like that. So you can bring in pressure groups as well with like the Vote Leave campaign and things like that. Or you could talk about how this issue featured in the EU referendum campaign. So the supremacy of Parliament was a prominent issue in the EU referendum campaign. Referendums obviously linked to democracy, direct democracy. And so you could get a link there. But hopefully you can kind of see here that there's not really a natural link there. This is probably the trickiest part of this question. But as we talk more and more about synopticity, about that word, you'll see that this is something you'd need to think about in the planning stage to make sure you kind of tick that box. All right, so now go and watch the feedback on your own individual essay.